critiquing pathological demand avoidance, in brackets PDA terminology and its prejudice and stigma by Richard Woods at London and South Bank University PhD student, and I'm currently on a gap year. So yeah, need to move on. So yeah, a bit about my perspective. I was diagnosed as autistic in 2012. I'm trying to use a post-autistic identity now. What I mean by that is I'm trying to base my identity independent of the psychiatric categories as much as I can do, although it's a bit difficult in practice. I do meet Elizabeth Neese's PDA profile, but I'm not emotionally attached to it. I do come from a large family which has lots of baggage in it. Several of my family members are neurodivergent. So yeah, I'm part of the critical autism slash disability studies group at London South Bank University, and I'm currently on a gap year for my PhD. I'm the project lead for the PDA special issue in Frontiers in Education, and I do peer review PDA manuscripts. So moving on, I do have some conflicts of interest, such as I am developing some PDA tools, and I do earn some income from delivering PDA training. I also reluctantly advocate for PDA to be diagnosed as a standalone entity thing, mainly because I think PDA is not going to go anywhere due to the hype around it, more than I think it actually should be diagnosed. Moving on from the lovely gif of carp, well, koi anyway. Yeah, it's just if you appreciate my work, please can you either like the video or subscribe to the channel. It kind of helps out a bit. So yeah, this video will be covering a few different areas. So a brief introduction to into the fact that psychiatric categories are controversial, and we'll be moving on to autism spectrum disorder and PDA dual diagnosis terminology issues before discussing some of the problematic aspects of PDA profile of autism, trying to use examples as much as possible. Those two sections are going to be relatively meaty-ish, and then I'm going to be briefly covering what features are medicalised with PDA and just ending on some reflective questions. I imagine this talk should be about 20 minutes to 25. So yeah, so moving on a bit more about the instructions still, I'm still getting used to using numeric referencing style, so it might be a bit rough in places in the actual slides, although I do think it is decluttering the actual slides quite a bit with me using it. On a personal note, it's been quite uncomfortable making these slides due to the fact that I am talking about how people are being treated in real life, such as actually experiencing stigma and prejudice associated with PDA. I mean, and I myself have been kind of victims of some of that stuff myself. So yeah, it's not particularly nice to write about when you kind of think about what's happening in practice. I also need to give a trigger warning. So there is we're talking about Filicide or caregivers killing their children very briefly on slide 23. So yeah, that trigger warning has been given. I cannot guarantee that I'll mention it before I get to slide 23. Yeah, moving on. So within the last 7 days, as of recording this video, in the UK, there's been a couple of newspaper articles on borderline personality disorder, and basically pointing out that it is incredibly problematic as a psychiatric category, and how it's often kind of arguably misused to diagnose adolescents with it. So this is a short letter by Keir Harding that was published in The Guardian in the UK, basically pointing out that over 1,000 kind of different clinicians and stuff wrote to the Royal College of Psychiatry last year arguing for them to change their advice for borderline personality disorder to be diagnosed in teenagers and stuff, and just saying that borderline personality disorder just medicalises kind of distress and trauma responses, is a general gist of it and stuff, and therefore it's inappropriate to diagnose it to adolescents and should only be diagnosed to people 18 or over. So moving on more recently, over the last couple of days of me recording this video, this article was published in the BBC, and it's talking about a case of a young lady who was given borderline personality disorder and how it kind of turned their life upside down. Again, similar kind of problems discussed as in the previous article. Again, pointing out the kind of the strong resistance from some practitioners to the borderline personality disorder kind of category. This one's getting a bit more interesting because while I don't have time to go into full ins and outs of the problems of borderline personality disorder with misdiagnosing autistics, especially like autistic women, this particular case study mentions said that they've had the borderline personality disorder diagnosis removed and they're now on the waiting list for an autism assessment. So it's maybe another one of those misdiagnoses would be borderline personality disorder, and the actual woman in question is actually autistic. So we're just briefly pointing that out. So just briefly mentioning that the autism subtypes in the DSM-4, so that's the version of the American Diagnostic Manual from like 1994 to 2012, had three subtypes which were Asperger's syndrome, autistic disorder, and pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified, or otherwise called PDD-NOS. And yeah, they were removed for various different reasons, but mainly because, well, not mainly, but partly because of, partly to reduce the stigma that all autistics kind of experience. Those removal from the DSM-5 was also partly done due to lobbying from autistics, mainly from the ASAN, which is Autism Self-Advocacy Network, off the top of my head. Basically a lot of autistics really dislike functioning labels, and a lot of autistics are critical of the proposed subtype of profound autism. This is because functioning categories kind of create problematic stereotypes which adversely affect kind of anyone on the end of these kind of functioning kind of spectrums. So in relation to the quote given here, the quote in the highlighted in the italicized text is from the 2015 England Autism Strategy, and it says, "This is particularly important for some people with autism, including those with Asperger's syndrome, who may face very significant challenges in their everyday lives despite having average above average intelligence quotient." The reason why that's being said is because one of these negative stereotypes from the DSM-4 subtypes was this notion that those with Asperger's who were meant to have average or above average intelligence, they're basically highly capable and have little to no problems with their everyday lives, which we know is not true. I've also put out in the bottom is I'm referring to my recent article that was published last year in the Lancet Child and Adolescent Health Journal, where I point out that further research is required to evaluate the risks of PDA. So the reason for that is that because researchers and practitioners should be evaluating the risks for how they actually choose to kind of model PDA, use it in research and practice. And so, moving on. So this is a very brief kind of introduction into PDA. So you have a series of 11 continua. So the green arrows indicate that it's kind of less of a problem, not a problem at all, and the red ends indicate that it's quite problematic or more of a problem. So these 11 continua are anxiety, avoidance of order demands, bullying, harassment, lying, stalking, stealing, etc., fantasy and role play, impulsivity, obsessive behaviour focused on people/characters, a need for control / drive for autonomy, like rapid mood changes, reinforcement-based approaches, such as those with applied behavioural analysis or positive behaviour support, are effective or not effective. Then it goes to socially strategic to manipulative avoidance behaviours to kind of fear of mind being intact or impaired. So you'll notice that PDA Profile of Autism on the left-hand side, and that kind of classic / more straightforward autism is on the right-hand side. And you notice that PDA Profile of Autism is meant to have more kind of impairment areas compared to kind of classic or more straightforward autism. I kind of question if that interpretation is correct. I argue that the end on the right of all these kind of continuas, it's just autism is just what's reflected in DSM-5 autism criteria, while the features represented on the left-hand side, or which some people call PDA Profile of Autism, is just features that basically belong to various co-occurring difficulties, like ADHD, anxiety, conduct disorder, obsession defiant disorder, and kind of trauma features. moving on, so getting onto PDA's terminology here. So I'm going to point out that how the PDA Society and other kind of PDA Profile of Autism advocates would suggest PDA is identified slash diagnosed, is that it's done as part of a kind of it's noted as part of a it's noted as a formulation as part of an autism diagnosis. So specifically from like page 20 of the PDA Society's document, it claims to be clinical guidance. It says that if the multidisciplinary assessment needs to the conclusion that a PDA profile is the correct explanation for an individual's marked demand avoidance within their autism diagnosis, there's a range of terminology that is used in formulations, including autism spectrum disorder with a PDA profile slash a pathological demand avoidance profile, or a demand avoidant profile slash our profile of demand avoidance, or extreme slash pervasive demand avoidance. So there's also a bit here down the bottom which I find interesting, is that the contributors recommend not using terms kind of traits or symptoms, as these have been taken to signify a lesser degree of difficulty than would be expected with PDA profile. So what they're trying to tell you there is that PDA is actually this really debilitating thing. I don't get why people would think symptoms is not something debilitating, but that's tangential. So yeah, if you look in the PDA literature, there's a current kind of connotations in how they describe it. So, yeah, so they kind of view non-PDA autism to be kind of conventional. They describe it as kind of classic autism. So that terminology is still used, so it's kind of used in the kind of document I mentioned about the PDA Society. So it's like kind of conventional understandings of autism. So there's kind of connotations to that. So that kind of PDA profile of autism is kind of atypical, unusual, unconventional, and unorthodox, unpopular. You can take it further to say that PDA is not autism. So if you look at kind of how they are describing PDA profile of autism, they would describe it as being complex or perplexing. So therefore, the opposite of that is non-PDA autism is kind of more straightforward presentation. So therefore, connotation that non-PDA autism is easy to interact with or to deal with. So you kind of get this connotation that PDA autism is really complicated and difficult to kind of know what to deal with, while non-PDA autism is the opposite. It's kind of easy. So you kind of get this false binary being presented within the discourse. So it gets a bit more interesting because, again, this document by the PDA Society states that the contributors' view is that PDA is currently best understood as a profile in brackets a cluster of traits on the autism spectrum. It's really quite weird how they're going to describe it, cluster of traits, but then still argue that traits is not severe enough terminology later on. But the reason I mention this is because I said they're still how PDA is kind of meant to be attributed under their advice and opinions is this dual diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder and PDA. And I would kind of question what is being conveyed when you tell someone they have ASD plus PDA dual diagnosis. Is that like double autism, or is it autism squared? What exactly is that ASD and PDA actually signifying to people? So is it telling you that ASD with PDA is less and more impaired than ASD, autism spectrum disorder without PDA? Is this ASD plus PDA dual diagnosis? Is it kind of telling you that a person has autism and all these other kind of features associated with PDA? So is it telling you that this person has autism and anxiety and demand avoidance and impulsivity and rapid mood changes, etc.? Or is it potentially telling you that a person is autistic due to anxiety and demand avoidance and impulsivity and rapid mood changes, etc., etc.? So this ASD plus ASD and PDA dual diagnosis could potentially lead to confusion as to what specifically is it trying to convey to people. So yeah, if one really pays attention to these connotations that PDA profile of autism is meant to be this highly impaired and debilitating thing, one could view it to be a function label. So this is a brief diagram, and please do not verify it. It's quite problematic if you do so. So on the x-axis is basically just intelligence, and the y-axis you have functioning slash and inverse support needs in brackets. So the background circle, the green one, is DSM-5 autism. The bottom right is pathological demand-avoidance or PDA profile of autism, and then the bottom left circle, yellow ellipse, is profound autism, which is a second proposed autism subgroup, which is often defined as having co-occurring intellectual disability and or language impairment. The reason why PDA is to right and associated with people with kind of a higher intelligence is because currently it's mainly diagnosed and research in speaking PDAs or PDAs without intellectual disability. So, yeah. Besides this, there are other kind of problematic aspects with PDA profile of autism, or the PDA, ASD plus PDA kind of dual diagnosis, when one kind of digs into it, which I'll kind of get into next. Hence this GIF with a panda just wrecking stuff. So, yeah. The PDA descriptions contain many problematic behaviours, and they're kind of, I'll provide links to kind of examples of these problematic behaviours. So I'll provide a link to a book chapter of mine where I kind of show example kind of items and PDA tools which contain stuff like lying, stalking, stealing, bullying, harassment, like writing threatening letters, kind of like being violent to pets and stuff, and because I've got a table in this chapter which kind of tabulates it in. I'll also put a link to the 11 revised PDA Disco items, which is open access, so people can look at these items and notice all the problematic kind of descriptions in there, which are kind of assessed as part of the PDA assessment using that tool. There's also a problem with the main kind of frame of the demand avoidance. So it's often framed as kind of an extreme or pathological avoidance to kind of ordinary demands or kind of other people's kind of requests. That kind of raises the question of like who would employ or provide an education placement for a person with a pathological or extreme avoidance to kind of ordinary demands or requests. So this is what this text box is here. It's from my recent article in the Lancet Child and Adolescent Health, and it just kind of points out what I've just said on this side, basically, if people want to go away and look at it. So moving on, actual kind of what does this prejudice and stigma look like in action? So like going on to some examples here. So yeah, I said I meet this with behavioural profile. I'm not most attached to it, so I kind of note that I'm a PDA in some of my email signatures and stuff. But by choice, I lack a PDA diagnosis because of this stigma and risk of stigma and prejudice from it. Irrespective of that, someone has written about me to other people, mentions pathological demand avoidance, so even a piece of advice might be taken the wrong way and might even cause blanked out, which is me, to do the opposite. So yeah, that's just rather not particularly nice thing to kind of say about people. So yeah, this is just an example of a advocate local team, and bear in mind I'm based in the centre of England. So this is an autistic parent who's got 2 autistic children, one suspected PDA, one definitely has a PDA diagnosis, I think by Richard Soppert off the top of my head. So yeah, this PDA has had multiple educational placement breakdowns, has been denied educational placements by basically loads of schools in England, to the point that they now have to go to school outside of England, despite their family living in the middle of England, or because a bunch of schools just will not take children with PDA diagnoses, which this child has. So that's not particularly brilliant. There's also literature noting that it's common for organisations to not recognise PDA diagnoses, and that can lead to caregiver frustration and stuff. Although some of the kind of lack of engagement with PDA diagnosis will be due to PDA's lack of supporting evidence. I should kind of acknowledge that. Got another example here. So this is an old one from when Harry Thompson was more prominent online on social media. This is from 2022. I need to apologise. I didn't actually take the reference for this. I just still got the screenshot. So, yeah. What it says is a mother of a PDA child I worked with recently carried out a search in a government school finder. They discovered that they are special educational needs schools in the Kent, UK area. Kent is a county in the south east of England. It's the one closest to France. So in the UK area, which have included in their admission criteria that they will not consider children with a PDA diagnosis. So it appears the specialist autism schools are now cherry picking certain autism profiles. Note the assumption that PDA is a profile of autism and accepting more kind of typified autistic children. Again, note how kind of non-PDA autism is kind of noted as kind of typical or classic or more straightforward, and they could be considered less complex by my clients concluded. And again, this connotation that non PDA autism or autism without PDA is considered to be kind of more straightforward, easier, kind of less. So Harry Thompson concludes: are these schools in Kent discriminating against children with PDA diagnoses? I mean, I'd argue they probably are, but this is what this side basically has just said. I've just basically described what I just said on the previous page. On the previous slide. So yeah. Noted about the language. Again, moving on. So, all trigger warning. So, this side is talking about filicides, that is, when caregivers kill their children. One of the unintended consequences of the horrible language that autism spectrum disorder often has is, well, not often has, but can have, is that caregivers can be so distressed at finding out their child is autistic that they can kill their child to escape the burden of autism. So, yeah, which isn't particularly good. There does seem to be at least one case where a caregiver was so distressed at the prospect of the child having PDA profile of autism that they become so distressed at this news that they just killed their young autistic child. This is what the screenshot kind of notes, and I think the article, if I recall correctly, describes PDA as being a severe type of autism. Here it does, it's like in the second kind of paragraph here. Again, note this kind of connotation, this dichotomy being formed, the PDA being this severe, debilitating form of autism, and non-PDA autism is meant to be less impaired, it's meant to be kind of easy, more straightforward. I hate this connotation, but kind of, sorry, I hate to be too strong a word, but I'm not impressed with it. I think is an accurate one. Kind of moving on. So we're moving on into kind of what features are being medicalised in kind of PDA profile of autism. So Damien Milton wrote in an essay in 2013 that that PDA seems to represent a medicalisation of autistics expressing social skills. Basically, and Alistair Moore later wrote in 2020 that PDA medicalises features that people express when they are distressed to assert their self-agency. So, and I'll kind of go and show examples of this using items from the 3 most commonly used PDA tools. So, yeah, these are example items associated with trauma or highly distressed individuals. So, the first one is the person seems as if he or she is distracted from within, and the second one is knows what to do or say to upset specific people. Again, they kind of lacks awareness of their own identity, or they're kind of driven by need to be in charge. And this side shows behaviours that people will often express to assert their self-agency. So attempts to negotiate better terms with adults, like apparently manipulative behaviour, and complains about illness or physical incapacity to avoid a request or demand. I just want to note that attempting to negotiate better terms of adults and apparently manipulative behaviour would be seen as skills or positive behaviours in non-autistic children. Um, yeah, moving on. So we're actually getting quite close to the end now. So these are the reflective questions. So, are you comfortable associating PDA's problematic behaviours with autism? Is PDA less or more impaired than autism? Is PDA Profile of Autism a functioning label? Are you comfortable with the PDA Profile of Autism terminology? What terminology could you be comfortable with? Just getting kind of potentially think about that. Are you comfortable with the kind of risk of the prejudice or stigma from PDA? And why may it be ethical to identify PDA Profile of Autism when it is unethical to identify Asperger's syndrome? At least currently, anyway. So I'm not saying if it is ethical to diagnose PDA Profile of Autism instead of Asperger's. I'm just asking a question for people to go away and reflect on. So, yeah. So these are my contact details. So there's my email address, my X/Twitter handle. The slides for this video will be on my ResearchGate link, but I'll also put them in the description. The YouTube channel you'll be watching this on. There will be no questions. This is the first of 3 reference slides. So I'll only linger on it for a few seconds so you can pause the screen to go and see the references if you wish to. This is the second one. So it's not much to really say. There's only 19 references in this one, so it's relatively short. There's less references in the previous video, which I was kind of pleasantly surprised by. And this is the final reference slide. So we're getting quite close to the end of the video. And yeah, so thank you for your time, and I hope you've have a good evening or whatever else you are doing. And I will end on my customary may one's stimming activities be many and one's flow states long, which is equivalent to live long and prosper. So yeah, that's it. And it is just over under half an hour.